Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight we continue our Greek mythology series with the Trojan Horse history's greatest deception, the 15th chapter in our journey through these timeless stories. The walls of Troy stand tall, but a shadow of betrayal looms. A wooden gift hides a deadly truth, and a city's fate hangs in the balance. If you haven't subscribed to Sleep Stories TV, join us now. Hit that bell and don't miss a single tale. Now let's step into the myth where guile triumphs over might and the legend of the Trojan Horse begins. After 10 years of war, the Greek army was exhausted, and the walls of Troy, said to have been built by the gods themselves, seemed truly impenetrable. The plains before the city were scarred with the remnants of countless battles, churned earth-broken spears, and the ghosts of fallen heroes whispering in the wind. The Greeks, an alliance of proud kings and warriors from across the Aegean, had come to these shores with fire in their hearts, determined to reclaim Helen, the stolen queen of Sparta, and to shatter the pride of Troy. But a decade of relentless siege had dulled their blades and sapped their spirits. The towering walls of Troy, crafted, it was said, by Poseidon and Apollo, in an age when gods walked among men, loomed as an eternal rebuke to their efforts. No battering ram could dent their stones. No ladder could scale their heights. The Trojans, safe behind their divine bulwark, mocked the Greeks from atop their battlements, their voices carrying over the clash of bronze and the cries of the wounded. Each day the Greeks hurled themselves against the city, and each day they were repelled, bruised, bloodied, and no closer to victory. The death of Achilles, their greatest warrior, had been the final blow to Greek morale. The son of Peleus, whose spear had cut through Trojan ranks like a scythe through wheat, lay dead, struck down by Paris's arrow, guided by the hand of Apollo. His loss was more than the fall of a man. It was the fall of hope. The Greek camp sprawled along the shore was a place of despair. Tents sagged under the weight of dust and time. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and unburied dead. Warriors who had once sung of glory now muttered of home, of olive groves, of wives, of children, grown tall in their absence. The kings, too, were weary. Agamemnon, the high king, paced his tent, his temper fraying like an old rope. Menelaus, Helen's wronged husband, stared across the sea as if he could will her back by the force of his longing. Even the priests who burned offerings to Zeus and Athena received no clear omens, only smoke that curled upward and vanished into an indifferent sky. The Greeks faced a bitter choice. They could admit defeat, board their black-hulled ships, and sail home to face the shame of failure. To return without Helen, without glory, would be to admit that 10 years of blood and sacrifice had been for nothing. Their names would be forgotten, their songs unsung. Or they could stay hammering at Troy's walls until time itself wore them down. But time was no ally. Supplies dwindled. Disease crept through the camp, a silent enemy more deadly than Trojan spears. The men whispered of curses of gods turned against them. Some spoke of abandoning the war altogether, of slipping away under cover of night, leaving Troy to its smug invincibility. The thought was a poison spreading through the ranks, sapping what little resolve remained. Yet in this moment of despair, a flicker of possibility remained. The Greeks were not a people to surrender easily. They were the heirs of heroes, the sons of a culture that prized cunning as much as strength. In their ranks was a man whose mind was sharper than any sword, a man who saw paths where others saw only walls. The stalemate at Troy was not just a test of endurance. It was a puzzle, a riddle that demanded a solution beyond brute force. The Greeks had tried war, and war had failed them. Now they would need something else, something daring, something unthinkable. As the sun sank over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, the camp grew quiet. Men sat by their fires, their faces drawn, their eyes searching for a spark of hope. In that stillness, a single figure stepped forward, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. His name was Odysseus, and in his mind a plan was taking shape, a plan that would change the course of the war and etch itself into the annals of history. The walls of Troy, impregnable as they seemed, were not the only defense the Trojans relied upon. Their confidence, their belief in their own invulnerability, was a weakness waiting to be exploited. Odysseus understood this. He knew that to breach the city, the Greeks would need to strike not at its stone, but at its soul. The idea that began to form in his mind was not born of desperation, but of clarity. It was a plan that would require patience, precision, and a willingness to embrace the unthinkable. As he stood before the gathered kings, his voice steady, his eyes alight with purpose, he began to speak. The men leaned closer, their weariness giving way to curiosity. What Odysseus proposed was not another assault, not another day of blood and futility. It was something entirely new, a deception so bold, so audacious, that it might just succeed where all else had failed. The Greeks, battered and broken, were about to embark on the greatest gamble of the war. And at its heart was a single impossible idea, a gift that would become a curse. In that moment of desperation, an idea sparked in the mind of the wisest and most cunning of the Greeks, Odysseus, king of Ithaca. The Greek camp, shrouded in the gloom of a decade-long stalemate, seemed to hold its breath as he stood before the council of kings. His eyes, sharp as the edge of a bronze blade, gleamed with a fire that had not been seen since Achilles fell. Odysseus was no giant among warriors, no towering figure like Ajax or swift-footed Achilles, but his strength lay elsewhere in a mind that wove plans as deftly as a weaver threads a loom. The Greeks had tried force, hurling their might against Troy's walls until their spears splintered and their shields cracked. They had tried fire, siege, and starvation, but the city stood unmoved, its towers mocking their every effort. Odysseus knew that strength alone would not win this war. The Trojans, secure behind their god-built walls, had grown complacent, their arrogance a chink in their armor. To defeat them, the Greeks would need to strike at their minds, not their bodies. And Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, was the one to do it. The council tent was heavy with the scent of oil lamps and the weight of unspoken fears. Agamemnon sat at the center, his brow furrowed, his hands clenched as if he could squeeze victory from the air. Menelaus, hollow-eyed, stared at the ground, haunted by the wife he had lost to Troy. The other kings, Diomedes, Nestor, Idomeneus, shifted uneasily, their patience worn thin by years of fruitless war. The air was thick with doubt, with the bitter taste of defeat that no one dared name. Odysseus stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the murmur like a knife. He spoke not of swords or spears, but of a plan so bold it bordered on madness. The Greeks, he said, could not break Troy's walls with force. They would need to make the Trojans open their gates willingly. The idea was simple in its audacity, yet intricate in its execution. It was a plan that played on the Trojans' pride, their faith, and their hunger for victory. It was a plan that required not just courage but trust in Odysseus, in each other, and in the gods who might yet favor them. The heart of his scheme was deception, a weapon sharper than any blade. Odysseus proposed that the Greeks build a monument, a grand offering to the gods, one that would seem to signal their surrender. The Trojans, he reasoned, were weary too. They had watched their sons and brothers die, their fields burn, their city endure a decade of siege. They longed for peace, for a sign that the gods had turned in their favor. Odysseus understood this longing, this need to believe in victory after so much loss. He knew that the Trojans, like all men, could be swayed by hope, by the promise of divine favor. His plan was to give them that hope wrapped in a lie so beautiful they would embrace it without question. The Greeks would craft a gift, a sacred offering, that would appear to be their final act of humility before the gods. But within that gift would lie the seeds of Troy's destruction. Odysseus's words hung in the air, and the kings leaned forward, their weariness giving way to a flicker of intrigue. Could such a plan work? Could cunning succeed where strength had failed? As Odysseus spoke, he painted a picture of the plan in vivid detail. The Greeks would construct a massive structure, a marvel that would capture the Trojans' imagination. It would be a symbol of their supposed defeat, a gesture of submission to the gods and to Troy's might. But it would also be a trap, a hollow shell hiding the Greeks' true intent. The idea was met with silence at first, the kings weighing the risk against the reward. Nestor, the aged voice of wisdom, nodded slowly, his eyes alight with approval. Diomedes, ever bold, grinned at the sheer audacity of it. Even Agamemnon, skeptical and proud, could not deny the brilliance of the scheme. It was a gamble, yes, but after 10 years of failure, what was one more throw of the dice? The council agreed, their voices rising in a chorus of resolve. The plan would require every man to play his part, carpenters to build, warriors to wait, and one man to lie so convincingly that the Trojans would believe him over their own instincts. Odysseus knew that deception alone was not enough. The plan hinged on precision, on timing, on the Trojans' willingness to let down their guard. It was a delicate dance, one misstep away from disaster. The Greeks would need to convince their enemies that they had given up, that they had abandoned their quest for Helen and their dreams of glory. They would need to make the Trojans see not a threat, but an opportunity. Odysseus's mind raced with the details: how to craft the deception, how to stage the retreat, how to ensure that the Trojans took the bait. He thought of the men who would carry out the plan, the warriors who would trust him with their lutes. He thought of the gods whose favor was never certain, and of the city that had defied them for so long. As the council dispersed, the camp buzzed with a new energy. The Greeks, so long adrift in despair, now had a purpose. Odysseus stood alone for a moment, staring toward Troy's distant walls. His plan was a spark, but it would soon become a flame, one that would either light the way to victory or consume them all. The next step was to give that spark a form, a shape that would deceive the Trojans and the gods themselves. Odysseus's plan was to construct a giant hollow wooden horse as a supposed offering to the goddess Athena to ensure a safe voyage home. The idea, born in the cunning mind of Ithaca's king, was as audacious as it was ingenious, a deception wrapped in reverence, a weapon disguised as a gift. The Greeks, weary from a decade of fruitless war, seized upon this spark of hope with a fervor that belied their exhaustion. The camp, so long steeped in despair, buzzed with purpose as carpenters, warriors, and laborers gathered to bring Odysseus's vision to life. The horse would be no mere structure. It would be a marvel, a towering creation that would capture the imagination of the Trojans and blind them to its true purpose. It was to be a sacred offering, a plea to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, for safe passage across the treacherous seas. But beneath its polished exterior, it would hide a deadly secret, a hollow chamber filled with the Greeks' most elite warriors, ready to strike when the moment was right. The plan was a gamble, a delicate balance of craftsmanship, deception, and divine favor. And every man in the camp knew that its success or failure would determine the fate of their war. The construction began at dawn under a sky streaked with the pale light of morning. The Greeks worked with a precision born of necessity, their hands guided by the urgency of their cause. Timber was hauled from the nearby forests, great trunks of oak and pine felled by axes that rang through the air like a call to arms. The camp's best carpenter's men, whose hands were as skilled with wood as warriors were with swords, took charge of the task. They measured and sawed, planed and hammered, their sweat mingling with the dust of the Trojan plain. The horse took shape slowly, its form emerging from the chaos of raw materials. Its legs were sturdy columns, its body a vast curved vault, its head a proud sculpture, with eyes that seemed to gaze toward the heavens. The Greeks adorned it with bronze fittings and intricate carvings, olive branches, waves, and symbols of Athena's owl and shield, making it a thing of beauty, a work of art that would seem worthy of a goddess's favor. To the Trojans, it would appear as a sacred relic too holy to be questioned. To the Greeks, it was a Trojan horse. In truth, a vessel of destruction cloaked in piety. Odysseus oversaw every detail, his sharp eyes catching, every flaw, his voice calm but insistent as he urged the workers on. He knew the horse had to be perfect, not just in its construction, but in its illusion. It had to be large enough to inspire awe, yet hollow enough to conceal a small army. It had to be sturdy enough to withstand scrutiny, yet light enough to be moved. The carpenters worked late into the night, their torches casting flickering shadows across the growing structure. The warriors, too, had their role, selecting the men who would hide within the horse's belly. These were no ordinary soldiers, but the bravest and most disciplined of the Greek ranks, men like Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and Menelaus, whose courage matched their trust in Odysseus's plan. They knew the risks to be sealed inside the horse was to surrender to darkness, to silence, to the mercy of their enemies. Yet they volunteered without hesitation, their faith in Odysseus outweighing their fear. The horse was more than wood and bronze. It was a testament to their resolve, a symbol of their willingness to risk everything for victory. The Trojans, watching from their walls, could see the strange activity in the Greek camp. The sight of the horse rising, its form taking shape against the horizon, must have puzzled them. Whispers spread through Troy, rumors of a great offering, a sign that the Greeks were preparing to abandon their siege. Odysseus had counted on this curiosity, this need to make sense of the inexplicable. The horse was designed to play on the Trojans' faith, their reverence for the gods, and their pride in their own endurance. By presenting it as an offering to Athena, the Greeks tapped into a deep well of Trojan belief. Athena was a goddess both sides revered, and the Trojans would see the horse as a gesture of humility, a concession of defeat. But Odysseus knew that the Trojans' pride would also make them reckless. They would want to claim the horse, to parade it through their streets as a trophy of their victory. The horse was not just a structure. It was a psychological weapon crafted to exploit the Trojans' desires and blind them to the danger within. As the horse neared completion, the Greeks began to prepare the next phase of the plan. The structure stood tall, its wooden flanks gleaming in the sunlight, its head raised as if in silent prayer. It was a masterpiece of deception, a lie so grand it could only be believed. Odysseus walked around it, his hand trailing along its smooth surface, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. The horse was only the beginning. For the plan to succeed, the Greeks would need to convince the Trojans that they had truly abandoned their siege. They would need to stage a retreat so convincing that even the most skeptical Trojan would lower their guard, and they would need a man to stay behind, a lone voice to sell the lie. As the camp buzzed with activity, Odysseus turned his gaze toward the sea where the Greek ships waited. The horse was ready, but the true test was yet to come. The Greeks had built their trap. Now they had to lure the Trojans into it. Inside the belly of the horse was a commando unit of the bravest Greek warriors led by Odysseus himself, waiting in the suffocating darkness. The wooden chamber, hollowed out with meticulous care, was a prison of their own, making a cramped, airless vault, where courage and fear waged a silent war. The men chosen for this mission were no ordinary soldiers. They were the elite of the Greek army men, whose names carried the weight of legend: Diomedes, whose spear had tasted Trojan blood; Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, burning to prove his father's legacy; Menelaus, driven by a husband's wrath; and Odysseus, the architect of this daring plan, whose mind was as sharp as the blade at his side. They crouched together in the horse's belly, their bodies pressed close, their breath shallow to conserve the stale air. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint slivers of light that crept through the seams of the wooden planks. The heat was oppressive, the scent of sweat and fear mingling with the tang of freshly cut wood. Every creak of the structure, every distant sound from the Greek camp set their nerves on edge. They were gambling their lives on a plan that hinged on deception, on the Trojans' gullibility, and on their own ability to endure this suffocating ordeal. The climb into the horse had been a ritual of resolve. As the carpenters sealed the hidden panel behind them, the warriors had exchanged glances, some grim, some resolute, all tinged with the weight of what lay ahead. Odysseus, ever the leader, had spoken softly, his voice a steady anchor in the growing tension. Trust in the plan, he had said, his words carrying the conviction of a man who had weighed every risk and found them worth taking. We are the blade hidden in the gift. We are the fire that will burn Troy from within. His men nodded, their faces set, though their hearts pounded with the uncertainty of what awaited them. Inside the horse there was no room for doubt, only discipline. They sat in silence, their weapons clutched close, their bodies still to avoid any sound that might betray them. The hours stretched on each one heavier than the last. The air grew thinner, the heat more stifling, and the darkness seemed to press against their eyes, as if trying to smother their resolve. Some whispered prayers to Athena, seeking her protection. Others gripped their swords, their knuckles white as if they could will the moment of action to come sooner. The warriors knew the stakes. If the Trojans suspected the ruse, they might burn the horse or drag it to the cliffs and cast it into the sea. If even one man faltered, coughed, shifted too loudly, or panicked in the claustrophobic dark, the plan could unravel. Odysseus, sitting at the center of the group, was a study in calm, his breathing slow and deliberate, his mind racing through every detail of the plan. He knew the Trojans would debate the horse, that voices of caution might rise among them. He knew, too, that the success of the deception depended on the next phase, the staged retreat of the Greek army and the performance of the man left behind to sell the lie. Inside the horse, the warriors could only wait their fates, tied to forces beyond their control. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of armor or the soft, ragged breath of a man fighting his own fear. They were not just soldiers. They were actors in a deadly play, their roles written by Odysseus, their stage a wooden tomb. The tension inside the horse was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing hour. The men could hear faint sounds from outside, the shouts of Greek laborers, the creak of ropes as the horse was moved, the distant crash of waves against the shore. Each sound was a reminder of the world beyond their wooden prison, a world they might never see again if the plan failed. Some thought of home, of Ithaca's rocky shores, of Argos's golden fields, of the families they had left behind. Others thought of Troy, of the city that had defied them for 10 years, its walls a symbol of their frustration. The horse was their last hope, their final defiance against those walls. They had fought with swords and spears, with fire and fury, and now they fought with patience, with silence, with the courage to do nothing until the moment was right. Odysseus, ever watchful, sensed the strain in his men. He murmured words of encouragement, his voice low but firm, reminding them of the glory that awaited if they succeeded. "We are the spark," he whispered. "Troy will burn because of us." As the hours dragged on, the horse was completed, its exterior polished to a deceptive sheen. The Greeks outside prepared to move it to place it where the Trojans would find it. Inside, the warriors braced themselves, knowing that the next phase would test their endurance even further. They would need to remain hidden, silent, and still, as the Trojans inspected their offering, as voices argued and debated its fate. The plan was moving forward, the wheels of deception turning, but for the men inside the horse, it was a moment of unbearable suspense. They were the heart of the plan, the hidden blade, but they were also its most vulnerable part. As the horse was rolled toward its destiny, the warriors clung to their courage, their faith in Odysseus, and the hope that their sacrifice would end the war. Outside, the Greek camp was about to enact the next step, a retreat that would lure the Trojans into the trap, leaving the warriors in the horse to wait for their moment to strike. The rest of the Greek army burned their camps, boarded their ships, and feigned a retreat, but they only hid behind a nearby island waiting for the signal. The act was a grand performance, a spectacle of defeat crafted with the precision of a poet's verse. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the Trojan plain, the Greeks set their plan in motion. Torches flared to life, their flames licking at the tents that had housed a decade of hopes and hardships. The crackle of burning wood filled the air, sending plumes of black smoke curling into the sky, a signal to the Trojans that the Greeks were abandoning their siege. Men shouted orders, their voices carrying the rehearsed panic of a retreating army. They tore down what remained of their camp, leaving behind a landscape of ash and ruin, as if their will to fight had finally crumbled. The black-hulled ships anchored along the shore for 10 long years were dragged into the water, their oars dipping into the waves with a rhythm that mimicked flight. To the watching Trojans high on their impregnable walls, it was a sight of triumph, a moment they had dreamed of through countless nights of fear and defiance. The Greeks, it seemed, were broken at last, sailing away in defeat. But this was no surrender. The Greeks were masters of war, and war is as much theater as it is bloodshed. Odysseus had designed this retreat as carefully as he had designed the horse itself, knowing that every detail must sell the illusion. The fires were set to burn brightly visible from Troy's towers, their smoke a message of finality. The men moved with urgency, but their chaos was controlled, their haste a carefully choreographed dance. As the ships sailed out from the shore, they did not head for home, but for the nearby island of Tenedos, hidden just beyond the horizon. There, shielded by the curve of the earth, the Greek fleet anchored in silence, their sails furled, their oars stilled. The warriors aboard those ships, thousands of men who had fought and bled for a decade, waited in the gathering dusk, their eyes fixed on the distant shore. They knew their role: to remain hidden, to hold their nerve, to wait for the signal that would call them back to Troy. It was a test of discipline, of trust in Odysseus's plan, and of faith that the gods had not abandoned them. From Troy's walls, the sight was intoxicating. The Trojans, who had endured years of siege, poured out onto their battlements, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and joy. Men pointed to the burning camps, women wept with relief, and children danced, unaware of the doom that loomed. The Greek army, which had been a constant shadow at their gates, was gone. The fires, the abandoned tents, the empty shore all told a story of defeat, of a foe finally driven away. The Trojans' pride swelled their hearts light with the belief that they had outlasted their enemies. They had faced Agamemnon's might, Achilles' fury, and the relentless grind of war, and they had prevailed. The gods, they thought, had favored them at last. Their city, built by Poseidon and Apollo, had proven as invincible as the legends claimed. The celebration began even before the last Greek ship vanished from view, with wine flowing and songs echoing through the streets. The Trojans' guard, so long held high, began to slip their caution, drowned in the euphoria of victory. Yet amid the wreckage of the Greek camp, one piece of the puzzle remained: the great wooden horse standing alone on the plain, its polished flanks gleaming in the fading light. It was a mystery, a silent question left behind by the retreating Greeks. To the Trojans, it was a marvel, a towering structure that seemed to pulse with divine significance. Whispers spread through the city. Was it an offering to the gods, a plea for safe passage? Was it a trophy of the Greeks' defeat left for the Trojans to claim? The horse was both a gift and a challenge, its presence stirring curiosity and desire. Odysseus had anticipated this moment, knowing that the Trojans' pride would draw them to the horse like moths to a flame. But the plan was not yet complete. The retreat had set the stage, but the deception needed a voice, a single man, to weave the final thread of the lie. As the Trojans gazed at the horse, their minds already turning to how they might claim it, the Greeks waited in their hidden ships, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The stage was set, the actors in place, but the success of the plan now rested on one man's performance. That man was Sinon, a Greek left behind to play the role of a deserter, a broken soul abandoned by his comrades. His part was as critical as the horse itself, for he would be the one to convince the Trojans to take the bait. As the Trojans approached the horse, their voices a mix of awe and suspicion, Sinon prepared to step into the spotlight. The Greeks hidden on Tenedos could only wait, their ships rocking gently in the waves, their eyes searching the horizon for the signal that would mean success or disaster. The retreat had been flawless, the illusion complete, but the plan was still a fragile thing, balanced on the edge of a knife. As night fell over the Trojan plain, the Greeks held their breath, knowing that the next act of this deadly drama was about to unfold. They deliberately left one soldier behind, a man named Sinon, tasked with playing the part of a pitiful deserter and telling a convincing, fabricated story. As the Greek ships vanished beyond the horizon, and the fires of their abandoned camp smoldered into ash, Sinon stood alone on the Trojan plain, a solitary figure dwarfed by the towering wooden horse. He was no warrior of renown, no hero whose name echoed in the songs of bards, but he was Odysseus's chosen instrument, a man whose tongue was sharper than any spear. His role was the linchpin of the entire deception, a performance that demanded not strength but cunning, not courage but conviction. Sinon's task was to weave a lie so compelling, so laced with truth, that the Trojans would embrace it without question. He was to be the broken remnant of a defeated army, a man betrayed by his own people, left to the mercy of his enemies. His story would be the key to unlocking Troy's gates, and he carried the weight of the Greek army's hopes on his shoulders. As the Trojans emerged from their city, their voices a mix of triumph and curiosity. Sinon prepared to play his part, his heart pounding beneath a mask of despair. The Trojans approached cautiously, at first their eyes drawn to the horse that loomed like a silent god on the plain. Its polished wood gleamed in the morning light, its carved features serene yet imposing, a riddle wrapped in divine mystery. The crowd gathered: soldiers, priests, women, and elders, all eager to understand this strange gift left by their vanished foes. Sinon stood near the horse, his clothes torn, his face smeared with dirt, his body hunched as if broken by hardship. He was the image of defeat, a man abandoned by his comrades, left to face the wrath of Troy alone. The Trojans surrounded him, their spears lowered, but their eyes sharp with suspicion. "Who are you?" they demanded. "Why do you remain when your people have fled?" Sinon raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting theirs with a mix of fear and defiance, his voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. He told them his name, his lineage, and then, with a storyteller's skill, he began to spin his tale, a lie crafted with the precision of a master weaver. Sinon spoke of cruelty, of betrayal within the Greek ranks. He claimed that Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, had turned against him, marking him as a sacrifice to appease the gods for a safe voyage home. The Greeks, he said, had grown desperate, their morale shattered by years of failure and the death of Achilles. Their priests had read the omens demanding a human offering to ensure their ships would not be swallowed by Poseidon's wrath. Sinon, a lowly soldier, had been chosen bound and left to die, but he had escaped. He told them, slipping his bonds under cover of night and hiding as the Greeks burned their camp and sailed away. His voice cracked with emotion, his hands trembled as he gestured toward the horse. The Trojans listened, their suspicion giving way to pity. They saw in Sinon a man like themselves, a victim of war's cruelty, a soul cast aside by those he had trusted. His story resonated, touching the hearts of a people who had known loss and betrayal in their own decade of struggle. The lie was masterful, layered with details that made it impossible to dismiss. Sinon wove in truths the Greeks' exhaustion, their fear of the gods, their longing for home, blending them seamlessly with fiction. He spoke of the horse as a sacred offering to Athena, a desperate plea for divine favor after years of hubris. He described the Greeks' debates, their fear that Athena had abandoned them, their decision to build this monument to appease her. The Trojans nodded their own reverence for Athena, making the story ring true. Sinon's words were a mirror reflecting their own beliefs, their own hopes back at them. He painted the Greeks as a broken people fleeing in shame, leaving behind this magnificent gift as their final act of submission. The crowd grew quieter, their spears lowered further, their eyes shifting from Sinon to the horse. It was no longer just a strange object. It was a symbol of their victory, a divine blessing meant for Troy. Sinon's performance was flawless, but it was not without risk. A single wrong word, a glance too confident, could unravel the deception. He stood alone, surrounded by enemies, his life hanging on the strength of his lie. Yet he held their gaze, his voice steady, even as his body shook with feigned weakness. The Trojans began to murmur among themselves, some calling to bring the horse into the city, others still wary, but swayed by Sinon's tale. The seeds of trust had been planted, and they were taking root. Sinon's heart raced, but his face betrayed nothing. He had done his part, setting the stage for the final act of Odysseus's plan. As the Trojans debated, their voices rising in excitement, Sinon glanced at the horse, knowing that inside its belly, his comrades waited in silence. The deception was working, but the Trojans' decision was not yet final. The next moments would determine whether the horse would be their prize or their doom. Sinon explained that the horse was a sacred offering, and that the Greeks had intentionally built it too large for the Trojans to bring inside their city. His voice, rough with the strain of his feigned ordeal, carried a quiet conviction that held the Trojan crowd in thrall. Standing alone on the plain, with the great wooden horse looming behind him, Sinon wove the final threads of his deception, each word a calculated stroke to turn suspicion into desire. The Trojans gathered in a restless semicircle, hung on his every syllable, their eyes darting between the ragged deserter and the towering structure that seemed to pulse with divine mystery. Sinon's tale was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to prey on the Trojans' pride, their faith, and their longing for victory after a decade of siege. He spoke of the Greeks' fear, their belief that Athena had turned against them for their hubris in waging war so long. The horse, he claimed, was their atonement, a grand offering to the goddess, meant to secure safe passage across the sea. But he added with a sly pause the Greeks had made it deliberately oversized, too massive to fit through Troy's gates, ensuring it would remain outside as a monument to their defeat. This lie was the decisive blow transforming the horse from a curiosity into a prize the Trojans could not resist. Sinon's words were like a spark in dry grass igniting the Trojans' imagination. He painted a vivid picture. The Greeks, desperate and broken, had crafted the horse not just as an offering, but as a final act of defiance. They believed, he said, that if the Trojans managed to bring it inside their walls, the city would become invincible, blessed by Athena herself. The Trojans' eyes widened, their murmurs growing louder as the idea took hold. To claim the horse would be to claim divine favor, to turn the Greeks' own gift into a symbol of Troy's triumph. Sinon's voice trembled as he described the Greek priests' warnings, their fear that the horse's power would shift to Troy if it crossed the city's threshold. He lowered his gaze as if ashamed to reveal his people's weakness, but his words were a lure baiting the Trojans' pride. The crowd stirred, their skepticism melting under the heat of ambition. Warriors gripped their spears not in threat, but in excitement. Women whispered of Athena's blessing of a future free from war. Even the elders, cautious after years of hardship, began to nod their doubts, drowned by the promise of glory. The horse itself stood as a silent accomplice to Sinon's lie. Its massive form, towering higher than the tallest man, was a marvel of craftsmanship, its wooden flanks carved with symbols of Athena, owls, olive branches, shields, that spoke to the Trojans' reverence for the goddess. Its size, which Sinon claimed was a deliberate barrier, only fueled their desire. To the Trojans, the horse was no longer just an object. It was a challenge, a test of their worthiness. They saw it as a divine gift left by a defeated foe, a trophy that would cement their victory in the eyes of gods and men. Sinon's story played on their deepest desires to prove their strength, to outwit their enemies, to claim the favor of the heavens. He spoke of the Greek carpenter's labor, of the priests, who had blessed the horse with sacred rites, of the arguments among the Greek kings about its size. Every detail was a thread in the tapestry of deception, each one making the lie more vivid, more believable. The Trojans, who had endured 10 years of war, saw in the horse a chance to end their suffering, to turn their long defense into a triumph. Yet beneath the surface of Sinon's performance, the tension was palpable. He stood alone, surrounded by a crowd that could turn on him in an instant. A single misstep, a word too bold, a glance too steady could unravel the entire plan. His heart pounded, but his face remained a mask of despair, his body hunched as if broken by betrayal. He knew the stakes inside the horse. His comrades waited in suffocating darkness, their lives depending on his ability to sell this lie. Beyond the horizon, the Greek fleet lay hidden, their ships rocking in the waves, awaiting the signal that only success could bring. Sinon's voice never faltered, even as he sensed the Trojans' hesitation. Some still questioned, their eyes narrowing as they studied the horse. Was it truly an offering or a trick? Sinon's tale was too compelling, too perfectly tailored to their hopes and fears. He spoke of his own suffering, of the Greeks' cruelty, and the crowd's pity grew, softening their doubts. They saw in him a man wronged by his own people, a man who had no reason to lie to his enemies. As the Trojans debated, their voices rising in a mix of excitement and caution, Sinon stood quietly, his work nearly done. The seed of desire had been planted, and it was taking root. The horse, once a mystery, was now a symbol of their victory, a divine gift they could not bear to leave behind. The crowd began to move toward the horse, their hands reaching out to touch its smooth wood, their voices calling for it to be brought inside the city. Sinon's lie had worked, but the plan was not yet complete. The Trojans' decision to claim the horse would set the stage for the final act, but there were still voices of caution among them, voices that could yet undo everything. As the sun climbed higher, casting the horse's shadow across the plain, Sinon glanced toward the city's walls, knowing that the next moments would decide Troy's fate. The deception was poised on a knife's edge, and the Trojans were about to make their choice. At that moment, two people spoke out, warning of the danger: the prophetess Cassandra and the priest Laocoon, who famously cried, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts." Their voices rose above the murmurs of the Trojan crowd, sharp and urgent, cutting through the haze of excitement like a cold wind. The plain before Troy's walls was alive with anticipation, the great wooden horse standing as a silent enigma, its polished flanks gleaming under the midday sun. The Trojans, swayed by Sinon's tale of Greek defeat and divine favor, were eager to claim the horse, to drag it into their city as a trophy of their victory. But Cassandra and Laocoon, gifted with insight that others lacked, saw through the veil of deception. Their warnings were a desperate plea to a people blinded by hope, a cry against the tide of folly that threatened to sweep Troy into ruin. Yet their words, though steeped in truth, were doomed to fall on deaf ears, their wisdom drowned by the crowd's fervor and the cruel whims of fate. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, stood among the throng, her dark eyes wide with visions of fire and blood. Daughter of King Priam, she was blessed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy, but cursed never to be believed. She saw the horse for what it was, a hollow vessel of death, a Greek trap that would bring Troy to its knees. Her voice, trembling with the weight of her visions, rang out across the plain. "Do not trust this gift," she cried, her hands raised as if to push the horse away. "It is a lie, a serpent coiled within wood. I see flames, I see slaughter, I see our city burning." The Trojans turned to her, their faces a mix of pity and scorn. Cassandra's warnings were not new. She had foretold doom before Hector's death, Paris's betrayal, and always her words had been dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others turning away. Her brother Paris frowned, his hand resting on the arm of Helen, whose beauty had brought this war to their gates. Even Priam, the aged king, looked upon his daughter with sorrow, unable to heed her pleas. Cassandra's curse was her tragedy, her truth a burden she could not escape, and as she spoke, her voice grew hoarse, her words lost in the wind. Laocoon, the priest of Apollo, stepped forward next, his presence commanding his voice a thunderclap. A man of faith and wisdom, he had served the gods faithfully, his life dedicated to interpreting their will. He stood before the horse, his eyes narrowed, his staff raised as if to strike the wooden beast. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts," he shouted, his words echoing across the plain. "This horse is no offering but a trick. Why would our enemies leave such a prize? Why would they flee after 10 years, only to gift us this?" He urged the Trojans to burn the horse, to tear it apart, to reveal its secrets before it could be brought within their poles. His voice was steady, his logic unassailable, and for a moment the crowd hesitated. Some nodded their hands, tightening on their spears, their eyes flickering with doubt. Laocoon's words stirred the embers of caution, reminding the Trojans of the Greeks' cunning, of Odysseus's reputation as a master of deceit. The horse, so beautiful and grand, began to seem sinister, its silence a threat rather than a promise. The air grew tense, the Trojans' excitement wavering under the weight of these warnings. Sinon, standing nearby, felt his heart lurch, but his face remained a mask of despair, his role as the broken deserter unshaken. Inside the horse, Odysseus and his men held their breath, the priest's words filtering through the wooden walls like a death knell. The plan teetered on the edge of failure, the Trojans' doubts threatening to unravel everything. Cassandra's visions, though ignored, carried the weight of truth, and Laocoon's logic was a beacon in the fog of their euphoria. The crowd began to argue, voices rising in a cacophony of fear and desire. Some called to heed the warnings to leave the horse where it stood. Others, still caught in the spell of Sinon's tale, insisted it was a divine gift, a sign of their victory. The horse stood silent, its carved eyes staring blankly, as if mocking the Trojans' indecision. For a moment, it seemed that wisdom might prevail, that Troy might yet be saved by the voices of its prophetess and priest. But fate, or the gods, had other plans. The Trojans' moment of hesitation was brief, their doubts soon to be swept away by a sign that would seal their doom. Cassandra's cries grew frantic, her hands tearing at her hair as she begged her people to listen. Laocoon, his face set with determination, prepared to speak again, to rally the crowd to his cause. But the gods who had watched this war with cold indifference were not done with Troy. The stage was set for a divine intervention, a spectacle that would silence the voices of reason and push the Trojans toward their fate. As the crowd wavered, their eyes fixed on the horse, the ground seemed to tremble with the weight of what was to come. The warnings of Cassandra and Laocoon, though true, were but whispers against the roar of destiny, and the Trojans stood on the brink of a choice that would echo through the ages. Immediately after Laocoon's warning, 2 giant sea serpents rose from the ocean and strangled him and his 2 sons to death, an omen the Trojans fatally misinterpreted. The air on the Trojan plain grew still, the crowd's murmurs falling silent, as Laocoon's words, "I fear the Greeks even when they bear gifts," hung like a challenge to the gods. The priest of Apollo stood resolute. His staff raised, his eyes burning with conviction, as he urged his people to destroy the wooden horse before it could bring ruin to their city. Beside him, his 2 young sons, their faces mirroring their father's determination, stood close, unaware of the doom about to descend. The Trojans, torn between doubt and desire, watched in uneasy anticipation, their gaze shifting from Laocoon to the horse, its polished form, a silent enigma under the midday sun. Then a low rumble stirred the ground, and a cry rose from the shore. Heads turned, eyes widened, as the sea itself seemed to boil. From the waves emerged 2 monstrous serpents, their scales glinting like wet bronze, their eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. The crowd gasped, stumbling back, as the creatures slithered onto the land, their massive coils churning the sand, their hisses a sound of primal terror. The serpents moved with unnatural speed, their bodies weaving through the air like living whips, their jaws gaping to reveal fangs as long as spears. Laocoon, still standing before the horse, froze, his staff falling from his hand as he saw the beasts bearing down. His sons screamed, their voices drowned by the crowd's rising panic. The serpents struck without mercy, one coiling around Laocoon's torso, its scales crushing the breath from his lungs, the other seizing his sons in its merciless grip. The priest's cries of agony mingled with the boys' desperate pleas, a horrifying chorus that echoed across the plain. The Trojans watched, paralyzed, as Laocoon fought to free himself, his arms straining against the serpent's coils, his face contorted in pain and defiance. His sons thrashed, their small bodies no match for the creature's strength, their cries fading into choked gasps. The serpents tightened, their grip bones snapping under their relentless pressure, until Laocoon and his sons fell still, their lifeless forms crumpled on the blood-soaked sand. The creatures, their task complete, slithered back into the sea, vanishing beneath the waves as swiftly as they had appeared, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The Trojans stood rooted, their faces pale, their hearts pounding with the sight of what they had witnessed. To them, the serpents were no mere beasts, but a divine judgment, a sign from the gods themselves. Laocoon, who had dared to question the horse who had called it a Greek trick, had been struck down in a manner too sudden, too horrific, to be anything but divine retribution. The crowd whispered of Poseidon, lord of the sea, whose serpents had defended the sacred offering. Others spoke of Athena, whose horse Laocoon had insulted, her wrath swift and merciless. The Trojans' doubts, so carefully stirred by Laocoon's logic, and Cassandra's visions, dissolved in the face of this terrifying omen. The horse, they now believed, was not a trap, but a blessing, a gift protected by the gods. To reject it would be to defy the heavens, to invite the same fate that had befallen Laocoon and his sons. The crowd's fear turned to reverence, their suspicion to certainty. The horse must be brought into the city, they declared, their voices rising in a fervent chorus. It was a trophy, a symbol of their victory, and a sign that Troy was favored by the gods. Inside the horse, Odysseus and his men, hidden in the suffocating darkness, heard the commotion, the screams, the gasps, the sudden silence. They could not see the serpents or Laocoon's fate, but the shift in the crowd's tone told them enough. The plan was working, the gods, or perhaps just cruel chance, had intervened on their behalf. Odysseus's heart steadied, his mind already turning to the next phase. Sinon, still among the Trojans, maintained his mask of despair, his eyes downcast as the crowd's attention turned from him to the horse. He had played his part, and now the gods had sealed the deception with blood. Cassandra, standing apart, her face streaked with tears, cried out once more, her voice a wail of despair. "Fools, you bring death within our walls." But her words were lost, her curse ensuring that no one heeded her truth. The Trojans, their resolve hardened by the omen, began to move toward the horse, their hands reaching out to touch its wood, their voices calling for ropes and rollers to drag it into the city. The death of Laocoon was a turning point, a moment where reason was crushed by superstition, where the Trojans' fate was sealed by their own misinterpretation. The serpents, whether sent by Poseidon, Athena, or some other divine force, had silenced the voice of caution, paving the way for the Greeks' final act. The Trojans, now convinced of the horse's sanctity, saw it not as a threat, but as a promise of invincibility. Their pride, their faith, and their desperation for victory had blinded them to the truth, just as Odysseus had planned. As the crowd began to prepare the horse for its journey into Troy, the plain buzzed with a new energy, a reckless joy that masked the shadow of doom. The stage was set for the final act of this deadly drama, and the Trojans' unwitting actors were about to play their part in their own destruction. In their triumphant celebration, the people of Troy tore down a section of their own mighty walls to drag the fateful horse inside, and held a feast that lasted through the night. The plain before the city, so long a battlefield, stained with blood and littered with the wreckage of war, now pulsed with a reckless joy. The Trojans, convinced by Sinon's lies and the divine omen of Laocoon's death, saw the wooden horse not as a threat, but as a symbol of their victory, a gift from the gods to crown their decade of defiance. The air was thick with the scent of dust and anticipation as men, women, and children poured from the city, their voices raised in songs of triumph. The horse, its massive form towering over the crowd, gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its carved features serene yet commanding, as if Athena herself had blessed it. The Trojans, drunk on the belief that their enemies had fled, resolved to claim this prize, to bring it within their walls as a testament to their endurance. But the horse was too large to pass through the city's gates, its bulk a challenge to their resolve. With a fervor bordering on madness, they made a fateful choice to dismantle a section of their own impregnable walls, the very fortifications said to have been built by Poseidon and Apollo to make way for their trophy. The act was both practical and symbolic, a gesture of hubris that would echo through the ages. The Trojans, who had held their city against the might of the Greek army for 10 years, now took picks and hammers to their own defenses. Men shouted orders, their voices hoarse with excitement, as stones were pried loose and beams pulled down. The walls, which had withstood countless assaults, crumbled under the hands of their own defenders, each fallen stone a step closer to doom. Women and children cheered, their hands clapping in rhythm with the workers' efforts, their laughter mingling with the clatter of tools. The horse, lashed with ropes and set upon rollers, began its slow journey toward the city, pulled by 100 hands, its wooden hooves scraping the earth. The crowd sang hymns to Athena, their voices rising like a tide, their faith in the horse's sanctity, blinding them to the irony of their actions. They were tearing down their own protection, inviting the enemy inside, all in the name of victory. The scene was one of delirious unity, a city bound together by a shared dream of glory, unaware that they were weaving their own tragedy. As the horse passed through the breached wall, the Trojan celebration reached a fever pitch. The streets of Troy, so long shadowed by fear, came alive with light and sound. Torches flared, casting flickering shadows on the city's ancient stones. Tables were set in the open squares, laden with bread, roasted meat, and jars of wine that had been hoarded through years of siege. Musicians played lyres and pipes, their melodies weaving through the laughter and chatter of the crowd. Men raised cups to King Priam, to Hector's memory, to the gods who had delivered them from war. Women danced, their skirts swirling their faces, flushed with relief and joy. Children ran through the streets, weaving around the horse, which now stood in the heart of the city like a silent god. The Trojans toasted their survival, their voices growing louder as the wine flowed freely. They spoke of the future, a Troy reborn, invincible, blessed by the horse that proved their triumph over the Greeks. The night stretched on the city, wrapped in a haze of drunken revelry, its people oblivious to the danger lurking within their walls. Inside the horse, Odysseus and his men endured their own silent torment. The sounds of the celebration filtered through the wooden walls, laughter music, the clink of cups, a cruel contrast to the suffocating darkness of their prison. They crouched in the heat, their bodies cramped, their breaths shallow to preserve the thinning air. Every cheer from outside was a reminder of the plan's success, but also of the peril they faced. If the Trojans discovered them now, there would be no escape. Odysseus, his mind ever sharp, whispered to his men, urging them to stay silent, to wait for the moment when the city slept. The warriors gripped their weapons, their muscles aching, their nerves taut with anticipation. They knew that the Trojans' joy was their opportunity, but the wait was agonizing, each hour stretching into eternity. Outside the feast continued, the Trojans' guard slipping further with every cup of wine, every song of victory. The city, so long a fortress, had become a stage for its own downfall, its people dancing on the edge of oblivion. The breach in the wall, the horse's entry, and the night of celebration marked the culmination of Odysseus's deception, but the plan was not yet complete. The Trojans, lost in their revelry, had forgotten the warnings of Cassandra, the logic of Laocoon, the lessons of a decade of war. They had opened their city, lowered their defenses, and invited the enemy inside, all in the name of a gift they believed divine. As the night deepened, the streets grew quieter, the songs fading into drunken murmurs, the torches burning low. The Trojans, sated and exhausted, began to sleep, their city vulnerable for the first time in years. Inside the horse, Odysseus prepared his men for the final act, their eyes fixed on the hidden panel that would soon open. The stage was set, the actors ready, and the signal that would unleash the Greeks' fury was only moments away. In the dead of night, when the entire city was in a drunken sleep, Sinon lit the signal beacon for the fleet, and the soldiers emerged from the horse's belly to open the city gates. The streets of Troy, so recently alive with song and laughter, had fallen into a heavy silence broken only by the snores of revelers and the occasional clink of an overturned wine cup. The torches that had blazed during the feast now flickered low, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, their light barely reaching the towering wooden horse that stood like a silent sentinel in the city's heart. The Trojans, exhausted by their celebration, lay sprawled in homes and squares, their minds dulled by wine, their bodies limp with the relief of a war they believed was won. The breached wall, torn down in their reckless joy, gaped like an open wound, unguarded and vulnerable. In this moment of stillness, the Greek plan reached its climax, the delicate threads of deception woven by Odysseus now ready to snap into action. Sinon, the lone deserter, who had convinced a city to embrace its doom, moved through the shadows, his steps careful, his breath held tight. He reached a high point overlooking the sea, struck flint to tinder, and set a beacon ablaze, a single flame that pierced the darkness, a signal to the hidden Greek fleet waiting beyond the horizon. On the island of Tenedos, the Greek ships stirred to life. The warriors who had waited in tense silence aboard their black-hulled vessels saw the beacon's glow and knew the moment had come. Oars dipped silently into the waves, sails caught the night breeze, and the fleet glided back toward Troy, their approach cloaked by the darkness. The men aboard Agamemnon, Menelaus, Diomedes, and thousands more gripped their weapons, their hearts pounding with the anticipation of victory after a decade of struggle. The sea was calm, the stars above, a cold witness to the unfolding drama. Back in Troy, inside the wooden horse, Odysseus and his men felt the weight of the moment. The sounds of the city had faded, the air inside their wooden prison grown thin and stifling. Odysseus, his voice a low whisper, gave the signal. The hidden panel in the horse's belly creaked open, the sound muffled but jarring in the silence. One by one, the warriors emerged, their bodies stiff from hours of confinement, their eyes adjusting to the dim light of the sleeping city. Odysseus led them, his movements swift and precise, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion that gnawed at them all. The warriors descended from the horse with the stealth of predators, their sandals silent on the stone. They were shadows in the night, their bronze armor glinting faintly under the starlight, their swords and spears held ready. The city was theirs for the taking, its defenses undone by its own people. Odysseus directed his men with gestures, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of movement. They moved toward the gates, their steps quick but cautious, aware that a single sound could rouse the city. The breached wall where the Trojans had torn down their own fortifications was their target, a gap that would allow the Greek army to flood in. As they reached the gates, the warriors worked swiftly, lifting the heavy bars, pulling back the massive bolts that had held Troy secure for so long. The gates groaned open, a low rumble that seemed to echo the city's impending fate. Outside, the Greek fleet was drawing closer, the sound of their oars lost in the gentle lapping of the waves. The beacon's light had done its work, guiding them to the shore where they would land and pour into the city like a tide. Inside the horse, the moments before their emergence had been a trial of endurance. The warriors had waited in darkness, their bodies cramped, their lungs burning for fresh air. The sounds of the Trojan feast had taunted them, laughter music, the clatter of celebration, each note, a reminder of the thin line between success and death. Odysseus had kept them steady, his whispered words a lifeline in the suffocating heat. "Hold fast," he had said, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is our moment. Troy sleeps, and we will wake it to ruin." Now, as they stood in the open air, the cool night a shock against their skin, they felt the weight of their mission. They were the spark, the hidden blade that would ignite the city. The gates swung wide, and the warriors took their positions, ready to defend the entrance until the fleet arrived. Sinon, his task complete, slipped into the shadows, his role in the deception done. The city, unaware, slumbered on its people, dreaming of victory while their doom crept closer. The silence of the night was deceptive, a fragile veil over the chaos to come. The Greek warriors at the gates stood ready, their eyes fixed on the dark horizon, where the first ships would soon appear. Inside the city, a few late revelers stirred, their drunken murmurs fading as they sank into sleep. The horse, now empty, stood as a hollow monument to the Trojans' folly, its carved eyes staring blankly at the city it had betrayed. Odysseus, his mind racing, knew that the plan was not yet finished. The gates were open, the fleet was coming, but the true test lay ahead, the moment when the Greek army would flood into Troy, turning celebration into slaughter. The night was still, but it was the calm before a storm that would leave Troy in ashes and its people broken. The warriors waited, their breaths shallow, their hands steady, as the sound of distant oars grew closer, heralding the final act of the greatest deception in history. The entire Greek army poured into the city like a flood, turning Troy's night of celebration into a night of fire, blood, and slaughter. The gates, flung open by Odysseus and his men, yawned wide, a breach in the city's heart, through which the Greek fleet surged with relentless fury. The ships, having slipped silently from Tenedos, under cover of darkness, disgorged their warriors onto the shore, their armor clanking softly as they raced toward the breached wall. Agamemnon led the charge, his face grim with the weight of a decade's frustration, his sword gleaming in the starlight. Menelaus followed, his heart burning for Helen, his steps driven by a husband's wrath. Diomedes, Ajax, and thousands more streamed behind their spears, lowered their eyes alight with the promise of victory. The Trojans, lost in drunken slumber, had no warning as the Greeks flooded their streets, their footsteps a rising thunder that shattered the night's deceptive calm. The city, which had stood defiant for 10 years, was now defenseless, its people betrayed by their own pride, their walls undone by a single cunning gift. The first screams pierced the air as the Greeks fell upon the sleeping city. Houses still warm with the glow of feast fires became slaughterhouses. Warriors kicked down doors, their blades finding flesh before the Trojans could rouse themselves. Men stumbled from their beds, groping for weapons, only to be cut down where they stood. Women clutched their children, their cries swallowed by the growing roar of chaos. The streets, so recently filled with song and laughter, ran red with blood, the cobblestones slick underfoot. Fires erupted as torches were flung onto rooftops, their flames leaping from house to house, painting the sky with an angry red glow. The great wooden horse, standing silent in the city's heart, watched over the carnage, its carved eyes impassive as the Trojans' dream of victory turned to ash. The Greeks moved with merciless precision, their years of frustration unleashed in a tide of violence that spared no one. This was no battle but a massacre, a reckoning for a decade of defiance. At the heart of the city, King Priam, old and frail, sought refuge at the altar of Zeus, his hands raised in a futile plea for divine protection. The sacred space, adorned with offerings and incense, offered no sanctuary. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, found him there, his young face twisted with vengeance. Priam, who had seen his sons fall one by one, who had led Troy through years of siege, faced his end with quiet dignity. The young warrior's sword flashed, and the king fell, his blood staining the altar, a final sacrilege in a night of horrors. Elsewhere, the Trojan women faced a different fate. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, was dragged from Athena's temple, her screams echoing her unheeded warnings. Andromache, Hector's widow, clutched her son Astyanax, only to see him torn from her arms, his fate sealed by the Greeks' fear of a future avenger. Helen, the cause of the war, was found cowering in Paris's chambers, her beauty a bitter reminder of the cost of desire. Menelaus, torn between love and rage, spared her life, but her freedom was gone, her fate now tied to the victors. The city burned, its towers wreathed in smoke, its walls crumbling under the weight of fire and neglect. The Greeks looted as they killed, tearing gold and treasures from homes and temples, their greed as fierce as their bloodlust. The marketplace, where merchants had once haggled over olives and prince, became a charnel house, its stalls overturned, its wares trampled underfoot. The great palace of Priam, a symbol of Troy's pride, was ransacked, its halls echoing with the clash of bronze and the cries of the dying. The Trojans, who managed to arm themselves, fought bravely, but they were too few, too scattered, too stunned by the sudden betrayal. Small pockets of resistance flared, sons defending their fathers, brothers shielding their sisters, but they were snuffed out like candles in a storm. The Greeks were a relentless wave, their victory absolute, their mercy non-existent. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege was falling in a single night, its fate sealed by the horse that stood at its center. Odysseus, the architect of this destruction, moved through the chaos, his mind already turning to the aftermath. He had no joy in the slaughter, but he knew its necessity. The war, so long a stalemate, was ending, but at a cost that weighed heavily on his soul. As he watched the flames consume Troy, he thought of the men inside the horse, of Sinon's courage, of the gods who had tilted the scales in their favor. The deception had worked, but it was a cruel victory, one that left a city in ruins and its people broken. The night stretched on the sounds of slaughter, giving way to the crackle of fire and the wails of the survivors. The Greeks, their fury spent, began to gather their spoils, their ships waiting to carry them home. Troy, the city of legend, was no more, its glory reduced to ash and memory. The stage was set for the final reflection on this night of betrayal, a lesson that would echo through the ages. The great city of Troy, which had stood for 10 years of siege, finally fell in a single night, due to a single trick. The story of the Trojan horse became an eternal lesson in warfare, that cunning can sometimes be more powerful than swords, and to never bring an enemy's gift inside your walls. As dawn broke over the ruined city, the first rays of light revealed a landscape of devastation. Troy, once a beacon of pride and power, was a smoldering ruin. Its towers blackened, its streets choked with ash and bodies. The flames that had raged through the night still flickered in pockets, their smoke curling into a sky that seemed indifferent to the tragedy below. The great walls, said to have been built by Poseidon and Apollo, lay breached and crumbling, a testament to the Trojans' own folly. The wooden horse, the instrument of their downfall, stood silent in the city's heart, its carved form untouched by the fire, a mocking monument to the deception that had undone a nation. The Greeks, their victory complete, gathered their spoils, gold, weapons, captives, and prepared to sail home, their ships heavy with the weight of plunder and the ghosts of a war that had cost them dearly. The fall of Troy was no triumph of heroism, no clash of champions under a blazing sun. It was a victory of intellect over strength, of guile over valor. Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, had proven that a single idea, carefully crafted and boldly executed, could topple an empire where armies had failed. The horse, a masterpiece of deception, had exploited the Trojans' pride, their faith, and their longing for peace. It had turned their strength, their impregnable walls, into their weakness, luring them to tear down their own defenses in a moment of reckless joy. The plan had required every element to align: the carpenter's skill, the warrior's endurance, Sinon's lies, and the gods' cruel intervention. Laocoon's warnings, Cassandra's visions, the Trojans' own instincts, all had been swept aside by the allure of a gift that promised glory but delivered death. The city that had withstood Achilles' fury, Hector's sacrifice, and 10 years of siege had fallen not to swords, but to a lie, its people betrayed by their own hopes. The cost of the victory was etched in the faces of the survivors. The Greeks, though victorious, found no joy in the ashes of Troy. Agamemnon, the high king, surveyed the wreckage, his triumph tempered by the knowledge that the gods' favor was fleeting, that the curse of spilled blood would follow him home. Menelaus, reunited with Helen, felt the weight of a decade's pain, her beauty a bitter reminder of the lives lost for her sake. Odysseus, the architect of the plan, stood apart, his mind already turning to the long journey back to Ithaca, a journey that would test him as much as the war itself. The warriors who had fought and survived carried scars both seen and unseen, their dreams of glory tainted by the screams of the fallen. For the Trojans, the loss was absolute. Priam's blood stained the altar of Zeus, his lineage shattered. Cassandra, Andromache, and the women of Troy faced captivity, their freedom traded for chains. The children, those who survived, would grow up in foreign lands, their city a fading memory, their heritage reduced to stories told by their conquerors. The story of the Trojan horse, born in that night of fire and blood, became a legend that would echo through the ages. It was a tale of cunning, of the power of the mind to overcome the might of walls and armies. It was a warning too carved into the collective memory of nations: beware the gifts of enemies, for they may hide destruction within. The horse, a symbol of divine favor to the Trojans, became a universal emblem of betrayal, its image invoked in every age when trust was broken by deceit. The war, which had begun with a stolen queen and a vow of vengeance, ended not with glory, but with a cruel lesson. The Greeks sailed home, their ships laden with treasure, but the cost of their victory was a shadow that would linger. Troy. The city of towers was no more. Its songs silenced its people, scattered its name, preserved only in the tales of its fall. The legacy of the Trojan horse is a paradox, a triumph of human ingenuity and a tragedy of human folly. It teaches that wars are not always won on the battlefield, that the sharpest weapon is often the one unseen. It reminds us that pride and faith, though noble, can blind us to truth, leading us to open our gates to ruin. As the Greeks sailed away, the sea stretched before them, vast and unyielding, carrying them toward uncertain fates. Odysseus, standing at the prow of his ship, looked back at the smoldering ruins, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had wrought. The war was over, but its lessons would endure, whispered in the halls of kings, sung by poets, and pondered by those who seek to understand the delicate balance between trust and treachery. The Trojan horse, a wooden lie, had changed the world, and its shadow would fall across history, a reminder that even the mightiest walls can fall to a single well-placed deception. And so, dear friends, we leave Troy in ashes, its mighty walls undone by a single cunning trick. The glory of the city fades, consumed by the flames of deception. The Trojan horse stands silent, a timeless warning of trust betrayed. The war is over, but its lessons linger etched in the annals of history. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If you loved this tale, subscribe and hit the bell. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done with the horse? Until next time, let the stars guide your dreams.